I grew up believing Mercedes-Benz was just a symbol of arrival. The car you bought when you had already won, already made it, already proven yourself. And it took me years inside real businesses to understand how wrong that surface view was. Because Mercedes was never built for people who wanted applause. It was built by people obsessed with getting things right, even when nobody was watching. Mercedes-Benz is not a luxury story first. It is an engineering story that accidentally became luxury. Because precision, when pursued long enough, always turns into status, whether you ask for it or not. Before Mercedes was a brand, it was an argument. Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz were not trying to impress society. They were trying to solve a mechanical problem that most of the world didn't even believe mattered yet. The idea that a machine could replace a horse was not exciting. It was insulting. Horses were reliable, understood, trusted. Early engines were noisy, unreliable, and dangerous. Betting your future on them looked irresponsible. But engineers don't move on consensus. They move on conviction rooted in physics. Benz didn't invent the automobile to change culture. Culture changed because the automobile worked. This distinction defines Mercedes to this day. Innovation at Mercedes has never been about novelty. It has always been about inevitability. When they build something, the internal question is not will people like this, but will this still function when everything else fails? That mindset is why Mercedes didn't just create cars, it created standards. Safety cages, crumple zones, anti-lock braking systems, airbags. These weren't marketing features. They were engineering solutions to ugly problems nobody wanted to talk about: death, accidents, failure at speed. Mercedes leaned into those realities instead of hiding from them, and in doing so, it quietly rewrote what responsibility in manufacturing meant. What people often miss is how expensive that philosophy is. Mercedes repeatedly invented technologies and then let competitors use them freely sometimes, for years, before the market rewarded the brand. From a short-term profit lens, this looks foolish. From a long-term trust lens, it's genius. Mercedes understood that once you are associated with safety and reliability, price becomes a secondary conversation. Trust compounds slower than hype, but it lasts longer than fashion. That patience is rare, especially in industries driven by cycles and quarterly pressure. Even when Mercedes entered motorsport, it wasn't about spectacle alone. Racing was a laboratory, not a billboard. Engines were pushed until they broke. Materials were stressed beyond comfort. Failures were studied obsessively. The lessons flowed back into road cars, invisible to customers who simply felt that Mercedes vehicles aged better, handled more predictably, and failed less catastrophically. That invisibility is the hallmark of real engineering excellence. When something works perfectly, nobody notices. When it fails, everyone does. Luxury followed almost as a side effect. When you design with no tolerance for sloppiness, the result feels expensive even if you never intended it to. Doors close with a certain weight. Controls respond with consistency. Systems behave predictably over decades, not just warranty periods. Mercedes didn't teach customers to desire luxury. Customers learned to associate Mercedes with calm authority and control under pressure. In a chaotic world, that feeling is priceless, but heritage is a double-edged blade. The same discipline that creates excellence can slow adaptation. As the automotive world shifted toward software electrification and digital experiences, Mercedes faced the same tension all legacy engineering companies face: how to honor a century of mechanical mastery without being trapped by it. Engineers trained to perfect hardware now had to collaborate with software teams that moved faster, broke things, and iterated publicly. That friction wasn't incompetence, it was identity stress. Mercedes' response was not to abandon its roots, but to reinterpret them. Electric drivetrains weren't framed as disruption, but as another engineering challenge to solve with the same seriousness. Software wasn't treated as decoration, but as a system that needed to be as reliable as a braking mechanism. This is slower than startup speed, but it is aligned with Mercedes' core promise. If we put our name on it, it must be worthy of trust. That promise cannot be rushed without being broken. What separates Mercedes from brands that merely trade on heritage is that the heritage is operational, not cosmetic. The past is not a museum piece. It is a standard that current engineers are measured against. Every generation must prove it deserves the three-pointed star. That internal pressure is heavier than any external competitor. You are not trying to beat Tesla, BMW, or anyone else. You are trying not to embarrass the engineers who came before you. That is a brutal but clarifying constraint. This is why Mercedes-Benz engineering innovation feels different from trend-driven change. It moves slower, but when it lands, it becomes foundational. Others race to be first. Mercedes aims to be right. That choice costs market share in the short term and earns legitimacy in the long term. In a world addicted to speed, restraint becomes a differentiator, whether the market realizes it immediately or not. And yet the real test of Mercedes' story doesn't live in its past inventions or current models, but in what happens when tradition meets transformation, head-on, when electrification, autonomy, sustainability, and digital identity collide with a brand built on mechanical truth. And this is where the story deepens and becomes uncomfortable, as the sentence continues into the next phase, where heritage is no longer enough on its own, and engineering innovation must prove it can evolve without diluting the trust it took more than a century to earn. And the journey moves forward into what comes next, where history stops protecting you and starts interrogating you. Because once the automotive world tipped into electrification, autonomy, and software-defined vehicles, Mercedes-Benz could no longer rely on what it had already proven. It had to prove that its engineering soul could survive in a reality where engines are silent, dashboards are screens, and value is increasingly invisible. This is the moment where many heritage brands fracture, not because they lack resources, but because they confuse respect for the past with obedience to it. Mercedes faced that danger head-on. The hardest shift was not technical, it was cultural. Mechanical engineering rewards certainty, predictability, and perfection before release. Software rewards iteration, learning in public, and tolerating imperfection long enough to improve it. For a company whose reputation was built on engineered like no other car in the world, embracing a world where updates ship over the air and features evolve after purchase felt like sacrilege. But Mercedes understood a critical truth: refusing to change would not protect its standards. It would slowly make them irrelevant. So the question became brutal and precise. How do you move faster without becoming sloppy? The answer was not to chase startups or mimic Silicon Valley language, but to reassert first principles. Safety still mattered. Reliability still mattered. Trust still mattered. The medium changed, the obligation did not. Electric platforms were designed with the same obsession for redundancy and durability as combustion engines once were. Battery safety, thermal management, and system fail-safes were treated not as differentiators, but as moral responsibilities. Autonomy was approached cautiously, not because Mercedes lacked ambition, but because it understood something hype-driven players often ignore. When you sell trust, one public failure costs more than 10 quiet successes can recover. This restraint frustrated investors and commentators who wanted speed and spectacle. But Mercedes has always played a longer game. It does not aim to win headlines. It aims to win decades. The three-pointed star is not a promise of excitement. It is a promise of composure under pressure. That promise had to translate into the electric age, or it meant nothing. Software stacks were rebuilt, internal silos were challenged, partnerships were formed where humility was required. Not every move was elegant, but the direction was deliberate. What is often misunderstood is that Mercedes' heritage actually becomes a heavier burden during transformation, not a lighter one. A startup can afford to break trust once. Mercedes cannot. When a Mercedes fails, it doesn't just disappoint, it undermines a century of accumulated belief. That weight slows decisions, but it also sharpens them. Engineers don't ask, "Is this impressive?" They ask, "Would we stake the star on this?" That question filters out shortcuts faster than any competitor analysis ever could. The real innovation here is not a specific technology, but the refusal to decouple progress from responsibility. In an industry racing toward autonomy and electrification, Mercedes is quietly insisting that moving forward does not excuse lowering standards. That position may not dominate social media, but it dominates boardrooms where long-term buyers, regulators, and institutions think about risk, longevity, and accountability. Trust is not loud, but it is stubborn. For founders and builders, this is the deeper lesson behind Mercedes-Benz engineering innovation and automotive heritage. Reinvention does not require abandoning identity. It requires translating it faithfully into new constraints. If your values only work in one era, they were tactics, not principles. Mercedes' challenge is not to become something new, but to remain itself under entirely new conditions. That is a far harder test than disruption, and this is why Mercedes' story continues to matter. Not because it was first or flashiest or fastest, but because it shows what happens when a company treats innovation as stewardship rather than conquest. In a world that celebrates speed, Mercedes is betting that there will always be a place for those who choose correctness over cleverness, durability over drama, and responsibility over applause. If this journey through Mercedes-Benz made you rethink the relationship between heritage and innovation, stay with this channel. Subscribe, because this is where we look past surface success and into the discipline that sustains it. And leave a comment sharing what part of Mercedes' transformation resonated with you most, because understanding how to evolve without losing your core is one of the hardest problems any builder will ever face.